What if I told you that everything you've accomplished in your first 40 years of life was just research? That according to one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, you haven't even begun to truly live yet? Carl Jung believed that most of us spend the first half of our lives building elaborate masks, chasing other people's definitions of success and avoiding the very thing that could set us free, facing who we really are. Today, I want to share with you Jung's radical perspective on when life actually begins, and why the moment you stop running from your true self might be the most terrifying, yet liberating experience you'll ever have. You see, Jung observed something that most of us refuse to acknowledge. He noticed that people in their 20s and 30s, despite all their energy and ambition, often felt empty inside. They had the career, the relationship, the social status, but something was missing, and Jung realized why. We spend the first decades of our lives in what he called a state of unconscious living, building what he termed the persona, the mask we wear to fit into society, to gain approval, to feel safe. Think about your own life for a moment. How much of what you do, say, and even think is genuinely yours? How much is just programming from your parents, your culture, your social media feed? Jung suggested that most of us are living someone else's life without even realizing it. We're actors playing a role we never consciously chose, in a play we didn't write. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. There comes a moment, usually around midlife, when this elaborate performance starts to crack. The mask becomes unbearably heavy. The life you've built starts to feel like a prison. And this is when most people panic. They call it a midlife crisis. But Jung saw it differently. He called it an awakening. This awakening doesn't happen overnight. It starts with small, nagging questions that you can't ignore anymore. Is this all there is? Am I living the life I actually want? Who am I when no one is watching? These questions emerge during quiet moments, maybe during a sleepless night, after a birthday that feels more like a deadline, or in the middle of what should be a career triumph that feels surprisingly hollow. The society around us treats these questions as symptoms of a crisis. We're told to buy something, change something external, get therapy to fix this discontent. But Jung understood that this discomfort isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's your psyche's way of telling you that you've outgrown the costume you've been wearing. The old ways of living, the priorities that once seemed so urgent, the approval you once craved. They start to lose their power over you. This is when Jung says the real work begins. And I have to warn you, it's not comfortable work. Because to truly live, you first have to face what Jung called your shadow. All the parts of yourself you've been hiding, denying, or pushing down into the darkness of your unconscious mind. Your shadow contains everything you've rejected about yourself. The anger you're not allowed to feel. The selfishness you've been taught is wrong. The creativity you abandoned for security. The dreams you called unrealistic. The parts of your personality that don't fit the image you've constructed. Jung realized that we can never become whole until we acknowledge and integrate these rejected aspects of ourselves. Most people spend enormous energy fighting their shadow, pretending it doesn't exist. But Jung discovered something paradoxical. The very things we hate about ourselves often contain the keys to our greatest strengths. The person who judges others for being too emotional might be disconnected from their own emotional intelligence. The one who criticizes others for being selfish might have never learned healthy boundaries. The individual who mocks others for dreaming too big might have abandoned their own authentic ambitions. This is why Jung emphasized that you cannot become who you're meant to be while rejecting half of who you are. Integration, not elimination, is the path to wholeness, and this integration requires tremendous courage because it means admitting that you're not the person you've been pretending to be. It means acknowledging that you're more complex, more contradictory, and more human than your carefully curated image suggests. But here's what happens when you finally stop running from your shadow. When you turn around and face the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, you discover that what you thought was your enemy was actually your ally. The anger you've been suppressing might be the boundary-setting energy you desperately need. The sadness you've been medicating might be pointing you toward what really matters. The fear you've been avoiding might be protecting something precious that you need to honor. Jung called this process individuation, becoming an individual, not in the sense of being isolated, but in the sense of becoming undivided, no longer split between who you are and who you think you should be, no longer exhausted from maintaining a performance that was never sustainable in the first place. This is when life truly begins, according to Jung. Not when you achieve external milestones, but when you achieve internal integration, when you stop asking, "What do others expect of me?" and start asking, "What does my authentic self require?" When you stop trying to be good according to someone else's definition and start trying to be whole according to your own inner truth. The shift from external validation to internal authority is perhaps the most significant transition a human being can make. In the first half of life, we're motivated by ambition, competition, and the desire to prove ourselves. We measure success by external metrics: salary, status, social media likes, others' opinions. But Jung observed that people who successfully navigate midlife begin to evaluate their lives by different criteria: meaning, authenticity, contribution, alignment with their deepest values. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or abandoning responsibility. It means taking responsibility for your own life in a way you never have before. It means recognizing that you are the author of your own story, not just a character in someone else's narrative. It means understanding that your primary obligation is not to live up to others' expectations, but to live up to your own potential. Neuroscience has actually confirmed what Jung intuited decades ago. Research shows that as we age, the emotional centers of our brain become more balanced. We become less reactive and more reflective. We develop what researchers call emotional regulation, the ability to feel our feelings without being overwhelmed by them, to respond rather than react, to choose our actions based on our values rather than our impulses. This neurological maturity creates the foundation for what Jung called conscious living. Instead of being driven by unconscious patterns, we become capable of making deliberate choices. Instead of living on autopilot, we begin to live with intention. Instead of being victims of our circumstances, we become creators of our experience. But let me be clear about something. This transformation isn't comfortable. Jung warned that individuation often involves what looks like falling apart. You might find yourself questioning everything you once believed. Relationships that were built on your old identity might not survive your evolution. Career paths that once excited you might feel meaningless. The very foundations of your life might need to be rebuilt from the ground up. This is why many people experience what we call a midlife crisis. But Jung reframed this entirely. What if it's not a crisis but a metamorphosis? What if the discomfort you're feeling isn't evidence that something is wrong, but evidence that something is finally going right? What if your life isn't falling apart, but rather the false parts are falling away, making room for something more authentic to emerge? Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote that the primary human drive is the will to meaning. Jung would add that this will become most urgent in midlife, when we can no longer tolerate living according to someone else's script. We demand a life that feels significant, even if it's different from what we originally imagined. This requires confronting the fears that have kept you playing small. The fear of judgment, the fear of failure, the fear of discovering that you're not who you thought you were. These fears can be paralyzing, but midlife offers a unique opportunity to face them head-on. Because by this point, you've probably realized that the alternative, continuing to live inauthentically, is more frightening than any external judgment could ever be. Abraham Maslow described this process as self-actualization, the drive to realize your full potential, to become the best version of yourself. But Jung's concept of individuation goes deeper. It's not about becoming a better version of who you think you should be. It's about becoming who you actually are, shadows and light together, complexity and contradiction included. Studies consistently show that people in their 40s, 50s, and beyond report higher levels of life satisfaction than people in their 20s and 30s. they feel more connected to themselves and others. They're less concerned with others' opinions and more focused on what brings them joy and purpose. This is the gift of midlife, the freedom to live on your own terms. Jung believed this freedom comes from embracing the full complexity of who you are. It's about integrating the light and the shadow, the successes and the failures, the dreams and the disappointments. It's about accepting yourself completely, even the parts you find difficult to face. As Jung wrote in his Red Book, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but it's also the most liberating. This acceptance doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on growth. It means growing from a place of self-compassion rather than self-rejection. It means recognizing that you don't need to be perfect to be valuable. It means understanding that your flaws and struggles aren't obstacles to overcome, but information to integrate. When you finally stop trying to be who you think you should be and start being who you are, something magical happens. You stop exhausting yourself with performance. You stop seeking validation from people whose opinions don't actually matter to you. You start making decisions based on your authentic desires rather than external pressures. This is what Jung meant when he said that life really begins at 40. Not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because you finally start asking the right questions. Not because you achieve some perfect state, but because you accept your imperfect humanity. Not because you become someone else, but because you become yourself. The research phase is over. The costume party has ended. The real performance, the one where you play yourself, fully and authentically, can finally begin. And this performance, Jung promised, is the only one that can truly satisfy the deepest longings of your soul. So I ask you, are you ready to stop researching life and start living it? Are you prepared to face the mirror and see not just who you've been pretending to be, but who you actually are? Because according to Carl Jung, that moment of recognition, terrifying and liberating in equal measure, is when your real life finally begins. The question isn't whether you're good enough to live authentically. The question is whether you're brave enough to find out who you really are when you stop pretending to be someone else. And that discovery, Jung believed, is the greatest adventure any human being can undertake.